have a bit of an unusual one today, as this is an ancient DOS game which isn't really as much of a game as it thinks it is. Omega. Now on the surface, this looks like some kind of overhead tank simulation where you control a tank to take out other tanks in various environments. Well, you got the simulation part right in that assessment, but notice how the tanks are behaving a bit odd? Yeah, that's because this quote-unquote game is all about creating these tanks out of components and then programming their AI with a proprietary programming language. Yeah, what you're seeing here is pretty much 90% of the game. Now, this is kind of taking after the old concept of Core War, a competitive game about making computer programs to fight each other within a block of memory. But this goes way beyond that by giving war vehicles to the programs you write with various stats and capabilities to take into consideration. Plus, you're now trying to code these things to take out one or more specific targets, as opposed to just trying to overwrite areas of memory. Now, on the surface, it sounds like a neat concept, programming AI to make these tanks go and do stuff. And it'd be interesting seeing how your code plays out, but at the same time, this experience isn't even remotely user-friendly, despite the documentation's efforts to try and make it sound like it's a piece of cake. And as a single-player experience, there's actually very little to do, as the game only includes a tiny handful of things for the player to mess around with by default, expecting the player to make their own simulations, their own battlefields, their own tanks, or to use BBSs to upload and download creations. On top of that, there aren't even good ways to play this as a multiplayer experience, since the interface is single-player only, and can't easily share data across multiple users on the same system, and if you try to access the inner workings of anything made by someone else, it stops you from doing so. Now, you can put other people's creations into your simulations, but you have no means to check chassis or AI details, meaning you have no means of comparison in regards to how weak or strong anything is. Ultimately, this is more of a software toy than a game, with a primary appeal towards programmers given how complex it is under the hood and how much of the content you effectively have to make yourself or get from other people. Omega was developed and released by Origin Systems in 1989 and is best classified as a one-player simulation game. Now, it supports the typical quartet of video modes for an 80s game, starting with monochrome Hercules graphics, going all the way up to 16-color Tandy and EGA at 320 by 200 resolution, but only supports the PC speaker for sound effects. As for its current release date, it's still commercial and very difficult to acquire, let alone search for in the first place. But thankfully it hasn't been completely ravaged by high demand, so when you do find copies, they go for fairly moderate prices, around $20 for loose discs and between $40 and $50 for fully boxed copies. Now, the reason it's difficult to search for, though, is because of its name. When it comes to technology, the term Omega has been used numerous times for both hardware and software, so narrowing everything down to this old PC game is tricky at best and impossible at worst. Also, when you do find a physical copy, be sure it's for the platform you want it on, as it was released for a slew of different computers. So I actually do have a fully boxed copy here, and we'll be going over its contents here as post-commentary. Now I do have to say though, they packed this box. You know how most game boxes come with little cardboard inserts to keep things from knocking around? Yeah, this box is so brimming with stuff, it didn't even need one of those. Now at the top here, we have the game itself on two 5¼ inch floppy disks. Next we have the new personnel orientation guide, which is basically a quick start guide if you want to just jump into things. Then we have a reference guide, which you would think would be a quick reference to the game's programming language, but no, it's instead a controls reference for anyone who doesn't have a mouse, as the keyboard controls for the different interfaces are a bit unusual to say the least. Next, we have Origin's 1989 product catalog, which is pretty much half Ultima and half everything else. Wait, don't toss this card. Nah, just kidding. This is the product registration card, plain and simple. Next up, we have a warranty sheet. And then following that, we have a curious piece of paper detailing a tournament Origin was holding on their own BBS related to this game. Now, as per whatever happened with this tournament, I have no idea. Information on this game is hard to come by online, and when I did ultimately find some personal pages dedicated to this game, along with downloads of various tanks and such, I didn't find any info on how this tournament ultimately played out. Last but absolutely not least, though, we have this massive brick of a manual with a very tight spine. I'd tell you how many pages are in this thing, except some genius thought the best way to number them would be to separate each chapter into its own set of page numbers, and then not number the index pages at all. Not that I let that stop me. 262 pages. The irony, though, having read through a lot of this manual, is that, well, it's not written very well. Now, since this game has such a strong emphasis on programming the AI for your tanks, you'd think a manual of this size would be dedicated to reference material related to that. But there's almost no reference material in here at all, and what does exist is not for the programming language. Instead, the reason this manual is so thick is because it focuses on step-by-step instructions to follow to familiarize players with the game as though being taught by an instructor. Like 80% of this manual is effectively a tutorial, meaning if you want to look up specifics on how to do something, or look up how to use a particular command or variable or whatnot, there's no easy way to do so. You either have to figure out where the particular thing is discussed in the tutorial, and it may be discussed in multiple locations at different levels of detail, and if you don't get the details you want, you're pretty much left guessing how it works, or trying to find out if it's mentioned anywhere else to a greater degree. For instance, there's a spot in the manual which notes being able to generate random numbers, but doesn't explain how, and a spot in the reference which shows what the random number generating command looks like, but again without explaining how it works, and one more spot in the manual which indicates the name of a system variable which stores the result of generating a random number. So if you want to learn how to generate random numbers, you're effectively having to look in 3 different spots in this massive manual to figure it out, none of which are properly indexed, and none of which explain the details of how this works. All that said, you still really do need the manual to get yourself going, otherwise the interface is just going to completely confuse you, as will any of the game's mechanics. This manual manages to be both equal parts necessary and useless at the same time, and could have been half the size if they just explained everything succinctly, instead of trying to do everything with in-universe speak that takes up twice as much space and it's harder to understand. So before we even get into the actual gameplay, an important thing to note is that the game alters itself and its startup method depending on if it thinks it's being run from a floppy disk or a hard drive. So it's kind of important to run it through its install process under DOSBox from an emulated or real floppy drive. Otherwise, you're going to run into problems trying to create a new profile. Which also has a fake retina scanner thing, which obviously doesn't actually scan your retina. Besides, given the static charge found on most CRT surfaces when they're on, I'm not sure you'd want your eyes that close to the screen. Once you're in, the game will give you some questionable advice, and will start following up with news bulletins, as the game kind of overcompensates with the whole immersion thing to the point where it almost seems silly how deep it's trying to go. Though that said, maybe it knows that too, as some of the news bulletins are kinda ridiculous. In any case, the first order of business when you start a new game is to dive right into designing your first tank. Now each tank you create is made up of 2 key aspects, the chassis and the AI. Now chassis design is very simple, as all you do is select components from various categories based on the amount of credits you're budgeted for the design. Now when you start the game, your security clearance level is standard, which allots you 1,000 credits for your design purposes, and each security level increase will give you another 1,000 credits to play with. The more involved part of designing a tank, though, is the AI. When you first load up the AI editor, you're effectively presented with a blank page and a bunch of buttons at the bottom of the screen. The manual gets a little complicated about this whole process, but the short of it is that there's effectively 2 ways to make the AI. You can either make it entirely from scratch, or you can build an AI out of a little bit of your own code while including capsules, which is done using the include command. Now capsules are effectively big sections of pre-programmed code that you can access from your own code so that you don't have to write that stuff yourself. The tutorial in the manual suggests a very simple AI design for your first tank, which simply includes 2 capsules, seek and destroy, and to access them in a loop as shown above. There's just one catch. In an effort to try and make a simple programming language, the devs effectively made this programming language unnecessarily temperamental. And one of the first things to remember is that if you don't indent a line, it's always considered to be a label. And for the non-programmers among you, a label is effectively a point in the program that you can jump to. In BASIC, instead of labels, you would have line numbers, so the command go to 20 would jump execution to line 20. A label is the same thing, just with a name instead of a number. This means if you have code that falls outside of any loops you make, such as includes, they have to be indented or the parser will think they're labels. You'll also notice that there's two ways to check your code. There's an authorized function and a verify function. Authorizing is done from the cyber tank menu and is how you affirm your code is good to go and thus your tank is ready for combat. Whereas verifying is supposed to work the same way, and it's done from the capsule menu, verifying the code. However, because verifying is meant for writing your own custom capsules, it can generate errors that you normally wouldn't see if you were authorizing instead. Back to actually writing the code though, you're going to run into limitations very quickly if all you do is include capsules in a loop. So naturally, if you want full control over how the AI works, you've got to write it yourself. Now, writing tank AI comes down to understanding a few basic nuances as to how this all works. Now, each command you issue requires one or more cycles to perform. Thus, the more complex your AI, the longer it takes to function. Now, there is an item you can install to double the AI processing speed, but it's very expensive. So unless you're writing very clever AI, it's not worth the cost. Like most programs, execution starts at the top of the program and will then follow through each command in sequence, jumping to other labels as indicated. Now there's two ways you can jump to another label, either with a do command or a branch command, which are respectively the same as Basic's go sub and go to commands. Branch jumps program execution directly, whereas do will make the jump but sets a return point so that when you call a resume command, execution will jump back to where the last do command was called from. In fact, you can use goto and gosub instead of branch and do, and I believe even return works in place of resume. There's definitely some inspiration from Basic going on with this language. The goal, however, is to make the tank itself function. To this end, the tank has 5 important aspects to it: tank movement, tank turning, scanner rotation, scanner results, and weapon firing. Now, if you can at the very least handle those 5 things with your code, then you're good to go. Now, thankfully, to make writing the code a little easier, you have those buttons at the bottom of the code window. These buttons allow you to click out the kind of code you want to write, and will then insert the appropriate code for you without having to look up the commands yourself. And this handles all the basic commands fairly well, but the moment any kind of variables come into play, it often stops being sufficient, and you'll have to look in the manual's reference pages to look up the various system variables and how they work. Basically, the AI you write needs to move the tank when appropriate, turn the tank when necessary, rotate the scanner to point at the things that you want to scan, see what the scanner results are and act appropriately, and then fire your tank's weapons when you feel it should. Again, keeping in mind that all of this takes time to perform. So the trick to writing good AI is to minimize how much time the tank wastes doing things you don't think it should be doing. One of the first challenges you'll face is dealing with obstacles. Now, if you tell the tank to move, but it's obstructed by something, it's still going to try to move through anyways and will suffer impact damage as a result. In fact, some maps can have water in them, and if a tank chassis isn't designed to handle water, you'll take damage from that as well. Now, scans can be done in a couple ways, but generally speaking, you want to scan for a closest object when deciding how to move or if you're obstructed, and scan for an enemy tank if you're trying to attack. Now, there's shortcut commands to help with this as well, but keep in mind that if you use these shortcuts, they'll often end up moving the scanner automatically, which might take a lot of time and might throw off the rest of your code. When you finally do make a scan that detects an enemy tank, you'd think, okay, time to fire the weapons. Except there's one problem. Even the weakest scanners can detect tanks up to 20 grid units away, but all of the weapons only have a range of 4 grid units. The trick is to use the scanner results to figure out if what you want to attack is in range or not, and then to use that information to decide on your next course of action. Keeping in mind that scanner results, by default, are only for the moment they occur. If you take too long to act on the results of a scan, your target may have moved out of the way by the time you go to fire your shot, and it's going to end up hitting the spot they were previously in. Basically, even once you know what you're doing, the way you make AI in this game is the same way you would make AI in any game: trial and error. You start by putting together something which you feel would do the job, run it through its paces, and watch to see what it does. If it does something you don't want it to do, you go back into your code, find a way to make it not do that, then try it again. And you keep working away at its kinks until it finally performs in a deadly manner. There's a couple ways you can go about testing your tanks as well. The more involved method is to design and run simulations. Now, simulations by default are made up of a primary tank, which will be focused on, and other tanks which will serve as the enemies, as well as a battlefield to put everything within. Though you can also configure teams as well, if your tanks are designed to be able to handle team-based tactics. Once you've designed your simulation, you can run it and then effectively watch the results play out. However, what you're more likely going to want to do at first is run your tank through evaluations. Each evaluation has a specific opponent and map in mind for each security clearance level, with the goal being for your tank to outperform the opponent tank in a minimum of 7 out of 10 battles. Now, this can actually take a while to perform normally, given all the graphics updates and sound effects, though if you engage the satellite view, the battles will typically progress much faster. Now, once I had my AI hammered out well enough to clear the first evaluation, I noticed that advancing to higher clearance levels was a lot easier, as simply applying better weapons and such to my tank designs was enough to do the job, and I just let the same AI run in place. Eventually though, once I realized my AI worked best blitzing the target, I added target lock functionality and took out its evasive features so it would just aggressively attack anything it locked onto. And the last thing to mention is that there's a battlefield designer so that you can make your own battlefields to run custom simulations on. But again, this is all for your own sake of customization, as the evaluation features won't use your custom maps. Now, heck, as you gain clearances, you aren't even given access to any more of the pre-built tanks, meaning with the exception of the Viper tank used in early evaluations, you pretty much have to use your own tank designs to put your own simulations together. Besides, this battlefield editor is actually not very intuitive. Even the text editor for the AI, despite having common cut, copy, paste, and undo commands, has some weird quirks of its own, which makes it surprisingly tricky to use. Such as how the home and end keys don't set the cursor to the start or end of a line, rather they send the cursor to the start or end of the entire block of AI code. Overall, as mentioned already, this is a game that really doesn't give you a whole lot to do out of the box, instead expecting you to either follow the massive tutorial to the letter or make your own fun with the tools provided. Now that in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, and what's here is fairly complex when it comes down to it, but the average person picking this up with no aspirations towards programming is going to be left bewildered and confused, and will likely return the thing to the store before getting anywhere with it. Now, speaking as a programmer myself, something I should mention is that, for me, programming is work, and I play games to have fun. So a game like this, which is focused on programming, to me, feels like work, not fun. Now, this is why I tend to avoid playing games where you need to be able to write code to make progress. Now granted, some people do enjoy tinkering with this kind of stuff, so for those of you who like programming-focused games, this is going to be right up your alley. But for everyone else, this is just too complicated with too little to actually do to be worth the effort of learning its nuances. Thankfully, setting this up in DOSBox is really simple, as all you have to do is leave cycle set to auto and you should be good to go. And again, don't forget to actually install the game properly, otherwise it might make it difficult or impossible to start up. And that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next Saturday will be an ADG Pro video, and we're going to be taking a look back at a couple platformers which I kinda don't want to ever play again, but I want to investigate an aspect about them which isn't well documented online. So be sure to tune in next Saturday to see what kind of crazy shenanigans I've got lined up here. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small random set of you guys.